Well, this is going to be a quick one. For those of you who were hoping I would make a review that was under 30 minutes, I think this time you'll get exactly what you wanted. Armored Core 6, or as some have come to calling it, Armored Core 6 out of 10, is probably the worst game From Software has made since Dark Souls 2. Now, as someone who kind of likes Dark Souls 2, that doesn't mean that it's a bad game. It's definitely not a bad game. Even though I don't give scores in these videos, it is a bit higher than a 6 out of 10, but it certainly did not blow my mind. There's going to be a lot of people disappointed with this game, especially people who watched Vati Vidya and expected this to be Armored Souls, Robot Souls, Mech Souls, which why the hell would you ever think that? You could literally just look up on YouTube what Armored Core gameplay looks like. But modern From Software fans are basically NPCs, so it doesn't shock me that they wanted yet another game that is press circle to win. And as someone who doesn't really play mech games and never played an Armored Core before this one, I can't really compare it to the old ones, so I'm mainly going to be comparing it to the mech games I have played, Zone of the Enders 1 and 2, and more importantly to this review, Custom Robo and Custom Robo Arena. So yeah, this is going to be another review that is clearly a mixed bag, and usually when a game is not overwhelmingly amazing, I tend to lean negative. So just know that going in before I further trigger any more of the From Software fanboys. Alright, without further ado, here is Armored Core 6. So yeah, first off, it's important to repeat yet again, this is not a Souls game. It has some minor Souls-like elements to it because From Software just has a certain way of designing video games that tends to work, so it makes sense that they keep doing that over and over again. Like I was saying in the intro, this is sort of like a combo of Zone of the Enders and Custom Robo. It has the part customization of Custom Robo, and it has sort of that fast-paced, lock-on gameplay of Zone of the Enders, but with a much heavier focus on ranged combat, where Zone of the Enders was much more melee-focused. So to explain what that means, instead of you being this huge, lumbering, slow-paced mech a la Battletech, this is much more like Gundam, where the robots are basically giant humans with giant guns and swords. I've heard people describe the controls of this game as moving a refrigerator on roller skates, and that's actually pretty appropriate, though with the addition of said refrigerator also having a jetpack. It's all about circle strafing around enemies, and in the case of a lot of the bosses, flying directly above them to get out of the way of their massive melee attacks. And as you're circle strafing, you're constantly firing one of the 4 weapons attached to you at any given time. That range from pretty much all sorts of conventional weaponry you've seen throughout video games: machine guns, shotguns, handguns, missiles, pulse weapons. I could go on and on. You kind of get the idea. You can just watch the gameplay and get a pretty good feel for it. And each of these weapons have to reload or they can overheat, so you sort of have to manage between your light weapons and heavy weapons, what ones to use, and what proximities they're good at. I mainly use close range weapons for most of the game. And to talk a bit more about customizing your armored cores, like I said, it reminds me of Custom Robo. On top of having those 4 weapon slots, you also can customize the head, torso, arms, legs. Your booster, generator, even the aim assist can be customized, and what you can equip to your robot is determined by the generator and your legs, which affect the maximum equip loads for energy and weight. And as you would probably imagine, the lighter robots move a lot faster than the heavier robots, but at the cost of having a lot less defense and a lot less health. So it definitely feels like your customization options matter. Now, one way I actually prefer Custom Robo style is that the array of weaponry feels a lot more varied, since that game had a bit more of a cartoon or toy-like style, so the guns could do all sorts of different stuff, whereas Armored Cores are much more conventional, and there's very few weapons that aren't just a variation on a type of gun, right? Like an energy rifle is just a sniper that is a laser. But they're not all like that. Plasma weapons leave like an area of effect field for a while. And there's a bunch of different type of homing missiles and all kinds of different variations of speeds, numbers fired, the time in between salvos, etc., etc. I'm certainly not disappointed by the amount of options they give you to customize your mech, but the game certainly could have benefited from a few extra unique types. A lot of the extra parts you find are just slight variations on other weapons. One of the most important ways that this is not a Souls game is that the dodge doesn't have invincibility frames. And this is going to be such a massive adjustment for people used to playing these press circle to win games that they're probably going to rage quit or get disinterested based on that principle alone. Me, I was completely tired of that shit, so I'm fine with it, but it definitely took some time to get used to it. The way you're strafing and the direction you're dodging might actually be more important than when you dodge, if that makes sense. Especially to avoid homing missiles or some super fast lasers that some of the bosses shoot. You're going to take so much chip damage that seems completely unavoidable, but it's just kind of part of the experience. It's not meant for no damage runs, though I'm sure some people will figure out a way to do it. You have 3 repair kits you can use throughout a mission, much like, an Estus flask. And as far as I know, you can never expand on that number, but you can improve the amount it heals, which will mainly just be important if you play as a heavier mech. And a very important mechanic that you'll be familiar with is the stagger meter, like Sekiro, where you have to build it up, and once you break the stagger meter, the enemy is stunned for a couple seconds, and the actual stagger gauge stays broken for several seconds after they're stunned, and all of your weapons do increase damage while they're staggered. This is something I've seen as one of the major criticisms against the game, that they focus so much on the breaking stagger stuff, that it sort of breaks the flow of gameplay because everything becomes centered around breaking that stagger gauge and then using the high DPS weapons, and you basically fight every mini-boss and boss the exact same way because of that. Now this actually makes it a bit more like a Souls game than maybe previous entries were, because then it becomes more about learning the boss movesets and how to dodge the attacks than it does about using specific strategies, but as we'll get into a little bit later, each one of the bosses encourages a certain type of build that is good against them. And this is something that's going to trip up Souls players, because Souls players are very used to beating their head against a wall until they eventually learn how to dodge like every attack, and then they win. In this game, if you have the wrong build for a boss, you're not going to win. I mean, maybe eventually after hours. I've heard that 2 bosses in particular in this game, some people fought for several hours before beating them. Me, I'm not that stupid. After I lose 7 or 8 times, I'm gonna go back to the drawing board. Maybe because I already had experience playing Custom Robo, which is very similar in that sense, I didn't get stuck on any boss for more than an hour. And fuck it, we'll talk about the bosses for a second. This game has some of the most inconsistent difficulty I've ever experienced in any video game. 90% of the time, maybe even 95%, the game is brain dead easy. You're shitting on all these fodder drones, just killing them in one hit with any of your stronger guns. And then the other 5% of the time, you fight the real bosses and they're an actual challenge. Now, challenge is not a problem. What is a problem is massive difficulty spikes that come out of nowhere. I've heard some people getting stuck on the tutorial boss for a really long time, which I have no idea how the hell you could be that bad at the game. I beat him on the 2nd try. But the first major boss after the tutorial, Baltius, who's in a fucking gamer chair and has a force field around him and shoots a million homing missiles, and halfway through the fight has a ring of fire that he swings like an ultra great sword around him, is such a massive, insane difficulty spike compared to anything before it that it is genuinely filtering people away from this game. Now, on paper, I don't have a problem with the games filtering out players. I don't care how many people end up finishing a game unless it is a quality control issue. If this boss was a representative of the difficulty of the game afterward, it would be completely fine, but it is not. The next challenging boss fight is not until an hour later against a sea spider, which some people got stuck on for even longer. Luckily, I already had the right build going in, so I beat him in 10 tries or something. With Baltius, once I'd failed to beat him a shit ton of times, I backed out of the mission, bought 2 of the pulse bubble guns and attached a sword and a shotgun to my shoulders instead of using missiles or anything. And I used the bubbles to pop his shield and then switched to the other 2 guns, and I beat him in 1 try after that. And as for Sea Spider, I used the quad legs hover mech, as that boss has a lot of ground attacks, and in the second phase has like a giant satellite laser, so staying high above it was incredibly effective. Nothing else challenged me again for several hours, for maybe a slightly unrelated reason, I don't know. I'll talk about that in a second. But for the most part, the game is not nearly as difficult as Baltius. And speaking of inconsistent difficulty, this game sort of has the same problem, though I personally don't even think it's a problem because I had fun with it, but we'll call it a problem for the sake of people who don't want to play in a specific playstyle. For the first time since probably Dark Souls 1, playing as a heavy character is actually viable in a From Software game. I can't believe it. Playing as a tank mech was fun as fuck for me, at least for a while, because instead of being this lightweight anime toy robot that has no weight to it whatsoever, just gliding through the air, circle strafing and dodging, I instead was just this tank that drove around and blew up everything in one hit, and had an insane amount of health and defense that I could just brute force my way through a bunch of challenges throughout the game. I think I ended up beating 4 out of the 5 next bosses in 1 try without really learning their moveset, by just brute forcing it with the tank, because I could overload their stagger meters before they could overload mine. And if you were curious, yes, I did end up using the tank build for the rest of the game, only swapping out double miniguns for double long-range shotguns, which were absurdly good for some reason. And the only time the second half of the game even remotely challenged me was against the Coral Guardian boss, which is just absolutely fucking insane. I don't know how the hell you would beat this boss with a normal lightweight mech. That just sounds like absolute torture. The thing is a fucking bullet hell boss in a game with no invincibility frames and no way to dodge directly upward, which is kind of strange. I feel like that would have been very useful here. And I even struggled a little bit with the tank at first, so I tried a lightweight build, and I just got annihilated over and over again. So I just did what I did for the rest of the game, and just gunned the robot down as fast as possible, and eventually that worked. It was such a giant pain in the ass, dude. It just isn't really fun after a certain point. Yes, I'm sure if you're really fucking good at the game, and you build the most lightweight mech, and you memorize every single fucking attack, all the homing lasers, and giant sword slashes that track your movement perfectly, etc., that eventually you'll beat both forms of the boss. But it is a million times easier to just load up a tank with the highest stagger damage weapons and just kill the thing in like 1 minute. Again, it was another insane difficulty spike over all of the previous content from the last 5 hours before it. Even though the final boss probably had twice as much health as it did, it was a fairly normal fight, all things considered. So this fucking coral robot thing was a piece of shit. I hated it. Terrible boss. So I've been fairly positive with this game so far. Why are people so disappointed? Well, there's a few major reasons, I'd say. The first one being that this game is very basic. You're doing the exact same thing from the start of the game to the end. You pick a mission, you kill all the robots in that mission, most of which are complete pushovers and easy, and then you go on to the next mission. It reminds me a bit of Metal Gear Solid Peace Walker, in that the game takes a very basic concept and then you just do that thing for the entire game. There's not a whole lot of other elements like exploration or environmental challenges, though there are a few missions where the environmental hazards are kind of most of the difficulty of it, like giant laser beams from the sky or a bunch of missile traps and tripwire lasers and things. But for the most part, if you're playing this to get a challenge, you're just trying to grind your way to getting to the next boss as fast as possible. And the arena fights are all kind of brain dead easy if you pick a tank build. I basically just ran in their face and spammed either the double miniguns or the double flamethrowers, and because I had effectively triple the health they did, I won every time. So the arena wasn't all that fun, and it's incredibly necessary to do because you can only unlock a bunch of upgrades through the arena, so you gotta do it. On the one hand, I really like basic games that you just do the same thing from start to finish, as long as the game gets progressively more difficult or interesting in some way throughout. But like I said, the difficulty is so inconsistent in this, and eventually you're going to start seeing the same maps over and over again. There's not a unique one for each mission, that the game did start to sort of feel repetitive past like the 10-hour mark, I'll say. And the game's about 15 hours, but there is a New Game Plus, and New Game Plus adds more parts, more missions that no doubt are harder. I haven't done any of them yet, that's just what other people are saying. So it's not like the game has an issue of content. I have no problem with a full price release having 15 hours plus some extra stuff if you want to play the game again. It's more just about this game obviously has a middleware feel to it that anybody who's played a bunch of video games will notice almost immediately. So obviously for a lot of people, that's not going to feel worth it full price, right? And if you're wondering if the story or the lore is any good, I'll admit I wasn't paying that much attention, but it seems pretty bare bones. You're basically playing as a mercenary in the far future, and the planet is called Rubicon, so obviously it is very important, and all of these different mega corporations are fighting over it, and since you're an independent mercenary, you end up working for different companies at different times. But honestly, I don't even remember why the planet is important. That's how forgettable the story was. I imagine it has some kind of unique resources or something. Maybe it has something to do with the coral, which is like some kind of weird mysterious energy or something, and your AI girlfriend comes from the coral, and I don't even know, man, what's even going on half the time. For the most part, I was just concerned with going in, killing robots, getting paid, going on to the next mission. Oh yeah, and I'm sure somebody's going to ask about PvP. Yes, I'm aware there is PvP. No, I didn't play any of it. I really did not care to. So I've got nothing to say about it. So in conclusion, should you buy Armored Core 6? Probably at a discount. It is a decently fun game, but it is also a repetitive game, and some people are just not going to like this style of gameplay. It doesn't appeal to this massive lowest common denominator that Elden Ring did, and that's a good thing. That's definitely a good thing, but I do wish that this was a more polished game, that it had more to it than just like going in a mission, killing some fodder robots, and then every once in a while getting a real challenge. That said, I'd be lying to you if I didn't say I had fun. I definitely had fun with this game. I like simplistic games where you just do the same thing over and over again, as long as it is very fun and it remains engaging the whole time. You've got to throw unique environmental challenges or different enemy types that make you play differently. This game did some of that, but certainly not enough of that. And nobody likes to be randomly super challenged out of nowhere, especially when the rest of the gameplay requires very little skill. Just having that 5 to 10% of the time where you actually have to try and get good is just not good gameplay design by really any metric. I don't know how you could argue in favor of that kind of difficulty design. It makes no real sense. So in that way, this is definitely not a Souls game. Souls games are infamous for any enemy being able to kill you, and that only became more true as the series went on. In this, 90% of the robots are drones that you can kill in like one hit. So like I said earlier in the review, this is kind of like a combination of Zone of the Enders and Custom Robo, with a dash of Metal Gear Solid Peace Walker level design thrown in there. But with the actual sandbox maps being much larger, not linear hallways, right? But you get the point. It's mission-based design, and occasionally you get a real challenge. And yeah, if you like that type of game, you'll probably like this, and I actually do kind of like that type of game. It just didn't quite meet the standards that I have for From Software these days. That's why I said it's like the worst game they've made since Dark Souls 2. But even Dark Souls 2 is not a bad game. It's a decently enjoyable game. It's just, you compare it to Dark Souls 1, and you're fucking mind blown that it's the same company, even if it was a different team. And I get the feeling people are going to think that about this game. They're going to think about Elden Ring that they played last year, and a bunch of Zoomer normies thought it was one of the best games ever made. But then they're going to play this and be mind blown that such a fucking middleware budget game could be made by these guys, because they probably didn't play any of From Software's games made before Dark Souls 3. Unfortunately, in the modern AAA space, you're just not allowed to make a lower budget game anymore. That's why every game takes like 5 years to come out, because normies want to play the quadruple A cinematic slop. Even when they want to play Elden Ring, which is all gameplay, the things that they really like about the game just kind of confuse me. Having to fight the same boss 5 times over and over again in the actual open world had no notable, memorable characters or quest lines. It was just basically an empty wasteland where you just went to the occasional dungeon and killed shit. That got old to me. Apparently, that's the best game ever made to some people for some reason. For me, I want something like Dark Souls 1 again, and it just seems like From Software is never going to make that game again. But I was very happy that Armored Core was something different, even if it wasn't exactly what I wanted. I like Custom Robo, I like this. And if you did like this game, I'm sure you're probably going to play the other Armored Cores or at least try them. But a personal recommendation for me would be Custom Robo on the GameCube, Zone of the Enders 2, and after you've played those, I'd say Custom Robo Arena on DS was surprisingly good, though you're definitely going to want to emulate that shit. Nobody wants to play on a tiny DS screen in the current year. So yeah, hopefully you liked and enjoyed this shorter review. I know I enjoyed making a shorter video, even though I know it will get less views. And I know a shit ton of my audience now apparently only cares if a game is woke or not, and not if the game's actually good. So, yeah, I figure this one's not going to do all that well, but Starfield is about to come out. So I was happy to just cover a game really quickly to have some content for this week, because it's probably going to take me like 2 weeks to make the Starfield video, I imagine. Hopefully Starfield is not another one of the biggest gaming disappointments in history like Fallout 4 was to me like 8 years ago now. So that's about it. See you next time, guys.